Hi, my name is Grayson Lewis, and today I'd like to talk about Codeigniter and data access. Specifically, I'd like to explore some of the different techniques that we can use within our models to interact with a database. After the screencast, you should have a better understanding of how to protect your applications against SQL injection attacks, how to write database agnostic code, and how to dry up your development process so that you're not repeating yourself within your models. To explore this concept, we'll use a sample application with a single controller called cities and a single method called show. And the purpose of the show method will be to display the contents of a single record. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's take a look at our model. We have a model called city, which extends CI model. It loads the Codeigniter database library. We have a method called findById, which retrieves a single record. And the technique that we're using to retrieve that record is authoring a select statement from scratch. The select statement reads, select all from city where ID equals, concatenate the user input, limit 1. Now this technique has two major issues. The first is this arbitrary space before limit. If we remove that space, we break our application. The second issue is that we're not escaping our user input. So we're essentially allowing our users to author their own select statements because anything they type in to the URI will be appended to our select statement and then passed on to the database engine for execution. So if we're going to use this technique, which we shouldn't, at a minimum we would need to escape this value. And let's go back to our application and make sure it works. But we can do a lot better. Let's delete the second portion of this select statement and instead say select all from city where ID equals placeholder. Once we add a placeholder, we can bind a parameter to that placeholder here. Now we have a very readable line of code, and because we're using bound parameters, our user input will be escaped automatically. But there's still one problem with this approach, and that is this limit 1 clause. Limit 1 is a nomenclature that's very specific to MySQL. If we wanted for our application to work with another database engine, such as SQL Server, we would need to use a different syntax, something like top 1, or for Informix, first 1. So the problem is that our application is now married to the underlying infrastructure, and we don't want that. We want to divorce our application code from the underlying infrastructure. So to generate database agnostic code, we can use Codeigniter's query builder, and that would look something like this. So from top to bottom, perform a query where ID equals ID, limit it to a single row, go against the city table, and return a row to the controller. Let's hop over to our application and make sure that still works, and it does. However, we've made a lot of progress. We've improved our data access technique. First, we've got bound parameters. Second, our code is database agnostic. Really the only gripe I have with this approach is that we went from 2 lines of code to 4 lines of code. So let's shorten it up a bit. We can use method chaining to bring this all onto a single line and eliminate the redundant calls to the database library. Now we've got a single line. Let's make sure that works, and it does. So now, again, we have a readable line of code. We have bound parameters, and our code is database agnostic. But there's still an issue with this approach, and that is, imagine for a second you have an application with 1,000 models. Do you really want to copy this findById method to all 1,000 models and then open each one and change city to whatever the table name is for that particular model? And the answer is no, we don't want to do that. So instead, let's use an object-oriented technique so that we can create a master model that all of our models will inherit from. So let's copy this entire class, and before we leave the city model, let's delete everything except for the constructor. Now, in the core directory of your Codeigniter installation, right-click and create a new file called My Model. Looks like I've already got one created. I'm going to delete it. Let's copy and paste our city model, and let's make a few modifications to it. First, it won't be called city, it'll be called My Model. And naming is important, as is case. We'll still extend CI model, and we'll still load our database library. The only thing we'll change is this static table name. To make that dynamic, we'll create a variable called thisTable, and at the top of our class, we'll define that. And that's it. Now we have a master model that our other models, like city, can inherit from. So let's go back to our city model, and instead of inheriting from CI model, we'll inherit from my model, and we'll initialize the value of this table and set it equal to city. Now let's go back to our application and refresh, and it still works. Now, if you think about it, this is pretty cool, because in the example where we have 1,000 models, well, now if all 1,000 of our models extend our master model, they will have all of the generic database operations that we build into our master model. So for example, we could build another method called find, and this method could return this db get this table, and instead of returning a row, we'll return a result. And now let's go back to our app, and let's click back. That'll take us to the index method, and it looks like we have a syntax error. Used a colon instead of a semicolon. Let's refresh the page one more time. And now we have a list of all 4,000 cities stored within our database table. Let's go back to show. We'll just click on a random city. So again, what we've done is we've developed a master model that has two methods, find and find by ID. Now, any model within our application that extends my model will also have those functions. So that's great. We've dried up our development process. The natural progression here is that you would continue to build your master model with other generic methods such as insert, update, and delete. And that would give your application full CRUD functionality without repeating yourself over and over again in each model. So what technique can we use to improve upon this even more? And in my opinion, the next step is actually to use a third-party library, such as Doctrine or PHP ActiveRecord. In the case of PHP ActiveRecord, the authors have developed something that's very similar to the master model or the my model concept, but really taking it to the nth degree. So by using PHP ActiveRecord, we gain a tremendous amount of functionality without writing a single line of code. So I'd like to run you through the process of getting PHP ActiveRecord installed, and then we'll wire up our controller to use it. So the first thing we'll do is we'll come back to our browser, and here's PHP ActiveRecord.org. And to quote these guys, it was authored by these guys right here. Matthew Machuga was nice enough to write a Codeigniter Spark for PHP ActiveRecord, which makes the installation of the library dead simple. We simply go to getsparks.org, click on the Install Setup page, scroll down just a little bit, and here we have a one-liner that when copied and pasted into the terminal within the root of our Codeigniter application, installs the Sparks Package Manager. Now that the Package Manager is installed, we can go to the PHP ActiveRecord page on getsparks.org, and similarly, through a single line of code, we can install the PHP ActiveRecord Spark. Now, in my case, it fails because it's already installed, but for you, it should work. The last thing that we need to do to get this installed is we need to load the Spark within our application. So we'll copy this line, we'll come back to our app, And within our controller, instead of loading our city model, we'll load our Spark. Now within our model, instead of extending my model, we'll extend ActiveRecord model. And just like before, we created a variable called table and set its value to city. Similarly, we'll create a variable called table name and set its value to city. And that's it. That's our city model. We can go ahead and close my model. When we come here into cities now, instead of calling the city model and the find method on the city model, we will call a method statically using city : find all. And for our find by ID, we'll do city : find, and we'll pass it the ID. And let's go back to our application, make sure that we've got everything wired up correctly. We'll refresh that page. And again, looks like we've got a syntax error. Let's come back to our application, and I used a colon again. Let's change that to a semicolon, and let's come back, refresh, and our application is working. So again, this is pretty cool because when we look at our city model, we haven't written any code. Yet, because we're extending ActiveRecord model, we have access to a find and a find by ID method. Now, down here, instead of using find by ID, we simply called find and passed in a parameter. However, PHP ActiveRecord has dynamic finders, so you can actually search on any column in your database. And the syntax to do that is find by column name. So in our case, if we wanted to change this to find by ID, since we do have a column called ID, we could simply say find by ID. Let's make sure that works. And it does. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how to protect your application from SQL injection attacks, as well as how to write database agnostic code, and how to dry up your development process so that you're not repeating yourself over and over again in your models. I highly recommend that you check out PHP ActiveRecord. I think it's an excellent library and deserves some exploration. Thanks for watching.